Good morning. Good to see you all here today. We're in John's Gospel. We're going to take a look at chapter 9 today. We've gotten through chapter 8, which was just some of the most theologically heavy dialogue in the whole book. Jesus is going through, remember we've got 7 signs in John's Gospel. That is the purpose of the Gospel. 7 signs that are meant to deepen our faith and strengthen our belief in the nature of Jesus, but there are also I am statements. And I am the light. And he'll revisit that one again. And we're going to get a new one. I am the good shepherd. So we get some I am statements. So this gospel is all about deepening our faith and strengthening our belief in who Jesus is. And that happens by what Jesus does, the 7 signs. It happens by the things he explains. So chapter 8 was a lot of dialogue from Jesus and a lot of challenging his Jewish audience. And it concluded, I'll remind you, in chapter 8, verse 58, when Jesus, when challenged about Abraham, you're not even 50 years old, how can you speak about Abraham like you know him? And his answer, verse 58, most assuredly I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. And so they took up stones to throw at Jesus. But Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by. Simply, his hour had not yet come. But they understood, and this is an excellent point we laid into pretty strongly last week. Some people will say that Jesus never claimed to be God. But that's exactly what he's doing in that verse. Before Abraham was, I am. Go back to the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3, and you'll see that is God's personal name, Yahweh. And Jesus is saying, that's me, I am. So he absolutely claimed to be God. And so they take up stones, and that's the setting where we get to chapter 9. So before we turn our attention to the text, though, now that we're caught up a little bit, we'll offer a word of prayer and then begin our study this morning in John chapter 9. If you bow with me at this time. Our wonderful and awesome God, our great King, our Creator, we thank you for your Son that came into this world to be such a light, to open the eyes of the blind. And we pray that we will perceive our blindness so that our eyes might be open to the truth, that we might have eternal life in your Son. We thank you that he showed us the way, that we can follow in his steps, hear his voice as the good shepherd, follow him, and be safe from all harm. We thank you for all the promise that we have in Jesus, for all that you showed on the cross as a pledge of your love to us, and we thank you for all the hope that we have in him. We pray that as we study this morning, we'll be blessed in this endeavor to see you, to know you more perfectly, and thus be more courageous and willing to share this light to those around us in this world. Similarly, we ask you to be with each Bible class teacher this morning, that our young children that are learning about you could hear the truth and have a strong foundation in their life as they grow and mature and as we raise them to know you. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so Jesus got through the I am statement, and last week we covered the first couple verses. This was really a much bigger discussion than one Bible class, but it was worth bringing up anyway because it's in here. Because the miracle where Jesus heals a blind man, we could just jump straight to verse 6 and go straight to the healing, but there's a reason why this dialogue is included. And as I pointed out last week, you're going to see a number of different reactions to this blind man. The apostles, the disciples in verse 2 are talking about him. They're not talking to him. They're not even acknowledging his existence. They're talking about him. And, well, he's an interesting situation, an interesting case to discuss. Well, who sinned? This guy or his parents that he's cursed to be blind? And so without repeating too much of what we discussed last week, like I said, there's a lot more to the question of suffering and why bad things happen in this world. So I'll just put the brief reminder of what we discussed last week. The bottom line is Jesus clearly answers neither. Your question is based on a false premise that someone has to have done something wrong, that yes, sin does have consequences, but not every bad thing is the result of a sin. That's the fallacy a lot of people make, and Jesus clears that up and says, nobody sinned. There's any number of reasons you could attribute. Maybe it is a punishment. Maybe it is something that God is doing to you to wake you up. Maybe it's something Satan is doing to you to challenge you. Or as Ecclesiastes points out, maybe it's just plain old circumstance. Time and chance happens to everybody. The question of why something bad happens isn't the question to dwell on, though it can be a useful question to consider. But the more important question, what is the more important question when dealing with adversity or hardship? Not why did it happen, but what does Jesus answer? Why does he say this happened? So he could heal him. And Mark?
Make good use of your pain.
Make good use of your pain.
Don't waste it.
Yeah.
For God's glorification.
It's an opportunity. And so those answers are correct. It's an opportunity. And that's what Jesus said. No, it didn't happen because he sinned or his parents sinned. But the answer is that so that that God could be glorified. So the works of God should be revealed in him. You make the question to not ask is why. The question to ask in suffering is, how can I turn this into something that glorifies God? Is there a lesson I need to learn? Is there some way I can turn my misfortune into a blessing for someone else? Maybe I went through a bad experience and I recovered over time and someone else is going through that bad experience. Now I can take that hardship of mine into a blessing and help this person navigate a similar bad experience that I had. So that's the question to dwell on is, what can I do with this to glorify God? How can God be magnified in this hardship? So this is a very nuanced question. That's why I put I didn't put reference to Job up there. We discussed how Job is one of the longest books in the whole Bible, which tells you the answer of why bad things happen is not an easy or simple or short answer. It's a complicated answer, but this is the best summary of why bad things happen. It's not every bad thing is the result of a sin or it's a consequence or a punishment of a sin. But you can always ask, how can I glorify God in this? So that's the context here. Is it starts with some discussion about why did this happen? But let's get to the miracle itself. So in verse 6, what Jesus does is kind of interesting, as it always is with Jesus. But he says in verse 6, he spat on the ground and made clay with the saliva. And he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. And he said to him, go wash in the pool of Siloam. Do you find anything odd about this? What is odd about the way Jesus goes about this miracle? How could he have done, what are some different ways he might have accomplished this miracle? He could have touched his eyes, or even simpler, he could have just said it. See. Receive your sight. Just like he did with the paralyzed guy that was lowered down through the roof. Get up and walk. And he did. Jesus didn't have to. Anything else peculiar about this miracle? Because look at what happens next. I also find it interesting that he makes him go to the pool. Well, he's still blind. Fumble your way around and find your way back to the pool. You don't get your sight back just yet. So Jesus, by the way, saliva was believed to have healing properties. That's just something I come across in commentaries pretty often. And so that's why Jesus would often use spit or things like that. It was just a common, nothing necessarily unique to Jesus, but more based upon their understanding of medicine, if you will, back then. But it's just peculiar that he makes him go and wash. But then, where is Jesus after he gets his sight back? We don't get Jesus again until about 30 verses later, in verse 30. Verse 35, that's when Jesus shows up. So just everything about this miracle is peculiar. The way and manner in which Jesus goes about this. And you always have to think about that. As easy as miracles are for God himself, the creator of all heaven and earth, think it, say it, it can happen. People were raised from the dead without Jesus even being in the vicinity of that person. It's always worth noticing when Jesus does something peculiar. Why did he put his hands on this person? Or like in Mark's gospel, why did he have the blind man that he healed, but he can only partially see? And then Jesus did it again. You know, we talked about that. Was Jesus just having an off day? No, he's showing us something. So when things don't go in a particular way that we might assume, there's probably a reason for it. And Jesus just disappears. Yes, Mark.
Coming into the light is not an easy. I'm just impressed that, okay, I've got this clan wise, I'm supposed to walk to the pool. Just one thinking like, hey, you got something, but it's one of those things like, but how bad do you want to be healed?
Yeah.
It's kind of like when you hear the gospel, when you hear the truth, and you have friends in the world or whatever, and everyone's kind of, there's all this conversation like, what are you doing there? What do you got that Bible for? Or whatever. And it's like, hey, I'm lost, I'm hellbound, I'm condemned.
Yeah.
Right now, I don't even hear you guys. I'm focused on, I need to get my life right with God. And also, Jesus kind of leaves the blind man, you're not a victim, you got to stand on your own 2 feet, and will you defend me?
Yeah.
Will you find your voice?
Yeah. And that's Satan's darts, I would say. When you're finding your way to Christ, there will be people trying to pull you in different directions. And I think that's Satan realizing he's losing his grip on you. Cecil?
People were people, and he could have said, wait a minute, the last 3 miracles you did didn't go like this, and I think you ought to handle me in a different way. So Jesus is teaching that he is the master, and he is the one that points out his mercy as to how he sees fit. And so he puts it in a different way, but he doesn't put it in a different way just to be different. He
Yeah.
puts it in a different way because he knew what the outcome was going to be. And so he drew himself back, and then we see how it continues to play out. And we find out what faith this man has, which was a faith to challenge the leadership there in that congregation. So this he knew all along, and then of course the conversation goes on outside of the congregation, which was really important.
Yeah, and this conversation that happens over the next 20 to 30 verses, okay, what we're looking at here is just a parable about what this whole gospel is about. So not only is he challenged about his belief, but we're going to see that the challenge deepens his faith. So it's just a further elaboration on those first 5 verses. Why does suffering happen? So that God can be glorified in it. We're going to see that his faith will deepen every time he's challenged. Challenge doesn't always bring out the best, but the best won't come out unless you're challenged. Steve?
We should probably go back and add all these up and see how many times Jesus heals someone on the Sabbath. This is another instance where it's done on the Sabbath. It comes up again, and man, Jesus is just pounding that because it exposes the Pharisees for the frauds and the hypocrites that they are.
Yeah.
So what? Even play on the Sabbath? Oh,
Yep.
no.
You won't find that anywhere in the law of Moses. It's their rules, not God's.
You have to walk somewhere for this? I think all that is purposeful.
Yeah, you won't find anywhere in the law of Moses where making mud is a violation of the Sabbath. You'll find that in their writings, their traditions, so it's their rules that Jesus is breaking, not God's. And we keep talking about the hour. John's countdown. His hour had not yet come. Well, that's why he keeps doing things on the Sabbath and why the context. We're still kind of in that setting of the Feast of Tabernacles, though I think we might have moved on, but we're still in that section. You'll notice, you jump ahead to chapter 10 and verse 22. Now was the Feast of Dedication in Jerusalem, and it was winter. I keep pointing out to you that John is not going chronologically, he's going thematically. So the first theme we looked at was the Passover. And then we were in the Festival of Booths. And pretty soon we're going to get to the Feast of Dedication. And so it's not necessarily in chronological order, it's what fits with the setting. And so those are good to point out. And he keeps doing these things during feasts, when everyone is in Jerusalem on a Sabbath. And it's almost like he keeps poking the beehive every time he's in Jerusalem. Ratcheting up the heat just a little bit till it's simmering and about ready to boil. But it's not his hour yet, but he wants the conditions right so that when he marches into Jerusalem riding on the back of a donkey and everyone's cheering and it is the hour, he wants it at that boiling point. It's ready to go. He just wants to keep it there simmering until it's time. So that's a good observation, Steve. So what we see in the next couple of verses, though, is a progression in his faith. So the first one we're going to point out is that he says he's a man. He believes because he's the one that was healed. He saw the evidence. I can see now, so I believe. So they first come to him. He goes to the water, washes, and comes back seeing. But now Jesus is gone. So therefore the neighbors, in verse 8, and those who previously had seen that he was blind said, "Is not this he who sat and begged?" Some said, "This is he." But others said, "He is like him." But he kept saying, "I am he. It's me. I'm the one. I'm the blind guy that can see now." Some people were believing it. Some people were very suspicious and just straight up denying. Can't be this guy. Just someone that looks like him. How many people had received their sight in the biblical record prior to this? It's not something they would see very often, if ever. This is something unheard of. So you can understand a little bit why they're hesitant to accept it right away. But it's plain that this is the guy. This is the blind guy, and now he can see. And so they ask him. In verse 11, he answered, they said to him, "How were your eyes open?" And he answered in verse 11, "A man called Jesus made clay and anointed my eyes and said to me, 'Go to the pool of Siloam and wash.' So I went and washed, and I received sight." And they said to him, "Where is he?" And he answered, "I do not know." You just got to love Jesus' style. It's not even there for all the excitement, but this conversation has to happen for our benefit that we can learn. But I want you to see, he believes. And I'll suggest to you that just like in Mark, the man who received his sight back in stages, remember Jesus healed him, but he said, "I can see men, but they kind of look like blurry trees." So Jesus said, "Okay, let me try again." And then he could see clearly. That was meant to tell us that we're like that guy. We can kind of see the message. We can kind of perceive the Messiah, but we need to see more clearly. We need to work on our sight. And so that was a message for us, the reader. And I suggest to you that the reason why Jesus disappears and lets this guy face these challenges is to show us the same kind of thing. That we're like this guy. To you, Jesus might just be a man, but we need to deepen our faith. So the trials that happen over the next few verses, they illustrate kind of in a small scale why trials happen in this life. The intended result is that our faith should be deepened. So let's go on a little bit further and see what the pressure does to this man. So in verse 13, they brought him who formerly was blind to the Pharisees. So now this isn't just neighbors or friends or onlookers. He's kind of going to the authorities now. The Pharisees were they were looked up as a leadership class. And so verse 14, it was a Sabbath when Jesus made the clay and opened his eyes. And the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, "He put clay on my eyes, and I washed and I see." Some of the Pharisees said, "This man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath." That's Steve's point. Making clay is a violation of the Sabbath, but not in God's eyes. Others said, "How can a man who is a sinner do such things?" And there was a division among them. Just like there's a division in the world today. Was Jesus a man? Was he even real historically? Was he just a prophet? Some major world religions say that. Was he the Son of God? There's divisions today. What do you make of him? So notice his answer now in verse 17. They said to the blind man again, "What do you say about him because he opened your eyes?" And he said, "He is a prophet." We see a little bit more depth to his answer. He's not just a man. This man, Jesus, healed me. He's a prophet. He answers with a little more affirmation. He's a prophet. Not just a man, he is definitely a prophet. So you see how it's kind of progressing through here. But then more happens. They bring his parents here. Verse 18, the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received sight until they called the parents of him who had received sight. And so again, what we see here is just differences in how this man is being used. The disciples in verse 2 talked about this man. They didn't talk to him. In verse 8, the neighbors labeled him. He's the blind guy. That's how he had been known his whole life. In the verses we just read, like in verse 15, the Pharisees are using him as a tool against Jesus, but they have no interest. They don't even care that this man's life has drastically improved. Kind of like the paralyzed man back in chapter 5. They wanted to kill Jesus because he restored this man's body and he could properly worship God at the temple like he had never been able to do. And they wanted to kill him for it. They can't even see. They're just using these people as tools to get to Jesus and accomplish their purpose. We see that in politics all the time, using classes of people as tools to accomplish purposes. And then in verse 18 and 19, we see with his parents, they don't even want to get involved. Sorry, we're not getting in on this. We're not speaking up. Different reactions. Jesus is the only one that seems to really show care and concern for this man's quality of life. So his parents come in verse 19, and they ask them, is this your son who you say was born blind? How does he now see? And his parents answered them and said, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but by what means he now sees we do not know, or who opened his eyes we do not know. He is of age, ask him, he'll speak for himself. I don't want to grill them too hard because maybe they weren't there, they didn't see the miracle. I can understand some of their reasons, but basically we wash our hands of this. He's old enough, you ask him. Not getting involved with this. How would this guy feel? His parents aren't standing up for him. That's some more pressure. Does it push him away from Jesus? Is he going to start wavering and start, backstepping? I don't really know. Maybe I just wasn't blind all along, or is he going to start backstepping, or is he going to be more firm in his convictions? Any questions or comments up to this point?
I think this shows just how dirty this whole situation is. When you see that, that's why John includes the parents. And he tells us, he gives us the why that's inside their head in a minute too. And so you can see you use the word pressure. You can see the pressure that the Pharisees are putting on these people to answer certain things in certain ways. Wow, we've never seen that before in our own lives, have we?
Yeah.
I mean, when you got dirty people, it's easy to take down liars when you have the truth on your side. And this is one of the most comical spots in the entire New Testament. This guy just takes the whole lot.
Yeah. His answers are fantastic in the next couple verses. And I mean, that's right. The Pharisees, it's bad enough that they don't believe, but they're threatening to throw people, excommunicate people, remove them from society, basically. They won't even let other people believe in Jesus. Cecil?
Verse 22 to 34, that was the see the light moment for me when I read this some time ago and saw that concise example of one person wants to stay in the group, they're not willing to admit to the truth. The other person who is faithful in believing of what the truth is, they get cast out from the group. And so this is a very concise example, which I don't think we've seen before in any other situations. And it's beneficial, of course, to us today. And how many examples have we heard of in our lifetime of someone who tells the truth in a congregation and they get cast out? And so this is a reality, and it's something that we face. And are we, this man who saw the light and run into the pressure like Steve's talking about, that, are we going to stand up for the truth that we know is true, or are we going to submit like the parents
Yeah. Well, and like the comment that was made earlier, where is Jesus rushing in and defending him? Jesus is letting this man struggle through it and stand on his own 2 feet and give his own answer. When we suffer for our faith, where is God to relieve the pressure? Where is God to make things easier for us? Very much like this illustration here, he is allowing us to go through this to strengthen us, I think, is the idea. But he's not going to, just like Jesus didn't come in and say, hold on now, I can explain everything. Quit being so hard on this guy. Jesus lets this happen and shows up afterwards. And this guy's faith is strengthened through it. Let's look at the responses here, because there, like Steve pointed out, there is a good amount of humor in his response. But also, this guy is, you can see how his faith is being solidified through this pressure. So his parents say he'll speak for himself. And in verse 22, they said these things because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore his parents said, if he is of age, ask him. So they again called the man who was blind and said to him, give God the glory. I think that was probably a common idiom, much like we might say in courtroom scenes today, remember, you're under oath. This is a reminder. Give a truthful answer. That's my understanding of what this is, an idiom, a common expression that they would be aware of. But the idea is, give God the glory. Give a truthful answer now, because they didn't believe his answer was truthful before. We know that this man is a sinner. And he answered and said, whether he is a sinner or not, I do not know. One thing I know, that though I was blind, now I see. This man just really boils it down to the most simplest elements. You come to whatever conclusions you want. I've never seen him sin, but here's the facts. I was blind, and now I see. You put 2 and 2 together, and what do you think that means? What do you think that says about this man? Just the basic elements of this are the truth that I was blind, and now I see. And he said again, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? And he answered, I told you already, and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? So he's standing up to him. How many times do I got to go over this? You're just not listening to me. Do you also want to become his disciples? Could you imagine their reaction to this? You want to be his disciples? Are you interested in him now? You keep asking about him. I mean, he's really getting under their skin. And you can see he's gone from a cautious answer to, well, I don't know how, but it was this man Jesus, to he's a prophet, to the facts are he healed me. And I don't need to explain myself over and over and over again. I stated the truth. Do you want to be this man's disciple too? And they reviled and said, you are his disciple, but we are Moses' disciples. We know that God spoke to Moses. As for this fellow, we do not know where he is from. The man answered and said to him, why? This is a marvelous thing, that you do not know where he is from. Yet he has opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard that anyone opened the eyes of one who has been born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And they answered and said to him, you were completely born in sins, and you are teaching us. And so they cast him out. How sad. But this name calling. And this is exactly the tactic of people on the losing side of an argument, and they know it. Just like in Acts chapter 19. They had no answer for the God that Paul was preaching, for the God that was stealing their idol business. So they just started shouting for 2 hours. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. We'll just shout our answer louder and louder. We don't have anything smart to say, so we'll just be louder than you. Or it's insults. And so, and this ties right back into perhaps why the first 5 verses are there. Because that was the predominant understanding, just like Job's friends. If you are suffering, you must have done something to anger God. And so they respond back, you were born completely in sin. And they told that to Jesus too. We weren't born of adultery like you. An insult at his mom. Todd?
Yeah, John 7, 24, Christ said this, stop judging by mere appearances,
Yeah.
So it's a very physical judgment that they pass to these people, and very seldom is it righteous.
Yeah, they should have seen, I mean, this guy just lays it out there. How could you not know where this guy is from? Have you ever heard of anyone open the eyes of someone blind? Do you really think that's the devil? Do you really think God is going to do that for a sinner, a miracle like this? In this guy's mind, it's obvious. Mark?
It's easy to focus on the pressure he was under, but actually the Pharisees are under a lot more pressure than he is if you look at it from a different angle. Because he's got the truth, and he keeps stating the truth. He doesn't back away from the truth. You know, the truth will make you free. And I'm impressed that they try to pull the "we know, we're the experts." And this is just a regular guy, like a lot of us are.
Yeah.
Just regular people. But what I'm impressed here is that we live in a world where a lot of time the experts will say, well, you can't trust it. You got to trust us. You can't trust the Bible. And it's like, it does come down to who I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And God's track record is amazing over the centuries. I'm going to trust that. The track record of human wisdom, yeah, I can't make that bet.
Yeah.
You know, I remember running into someone who said he was talking to a Mormon, and the man was honest enough to say, everything I believe hinges on one fact, whether or not Joseph Smith was God's final prophet to mankind. And he was willing to throw everything into that bet. And I'm going like, man, I can't do that. Now, I can throw everything on Jesus.
Yeah.
I can do that. And so, anytime you run into where the world says, okay, Christian, don't trust your Bible on this because we know. No.
Yeah.
Human wisdom has a horrible track record. I'm going to go with God every time.
Yeah, go back 200 years and they were cutting and letting blood as a solution and thinking that human behavior was determined by the shape of your skull. Yeah, human wisdom does not have a good track record. But that's a great point, that the pressure of defending a lie, and that's a great application of how the truth will set you free. That he didn't feel the pressure now. I mean, yes, there was legitimate threats, but when you know the truth and you believe it, it doesn't matter what people could do to you anymore. Jay?
So they're basing their judgment on their own beliefs of what the Sabbath says, right?
Yeah.
Talking about, well, he can't be from God because he made clay, and that's against the Sabbath. And instead of going back to, going foundational.
They're moving the goalposts and setting them where they want.
And to make an application today, I mean, we can point to 1 Thessalonians 5:22, talking about abstain from every form of evil. Some versions say every appearance of evil. And so people will draw conclusions. They'll put hedges around certain things.
Mm-hmm.
And point to that as a stopgap, and the law itself, well, what's an appearance? It's an appearance of evil, and not actually look at what the law actually says.
Yeah. Yeah, we want to be careful of not repeating the Pharisees' mistakes of they made rules to guard you from breaking the rules, but now you're in trouble if you break our rules, which are designed to keep you from breaking God's rules. But building that hedge around, you're right. We want to be sure we avoid the mistakes of the Pharisees. And that's why they're judging with the wrong motives, because they're judging based upon their traditions. And I just love this man's answers. It's just plain to see. How can this be? And I like it's very sarcastic. Why, this is a marvelous thing that you don't know where he is from. Yet he's opened my eyes. You can't deny the miracle. And just like when Jesus healed the lame man, we can't deny that a notable miracle has taken place. But we still want to kill him. You can't deny the miracle that had taken place. And he says, this is just a marvelous thing. How can you not figure this out? It's as plain to see as the nose on my face. Steve and then Cecil.
They can't figure it out because they don't want to figure it out. I think the crux of their whole argument is trying to separate Jesus from God. That's why they make that statement in the beginning, give God the glory, not Jesus. And then by the end of the argument, when they're just getting trashed, they say, well, we're with Moses. Meaning, we know Moses spoke to God, but we don't know that God spoke to Jesus. They're constantly trying to separate Jesus from God. And the blind man
Yeah.
He is connected to God.
No one else has done anything like this before. How do you explain it? Cecil?
This is almost an anomaly. This man who apparently didn't know who Jesus was demonstrated that he was not a disciple of Christ at the time. And so here he is, based upon his Old Testament faith of Judaism, actually did exactly what God had in mind. And it's supposed to be spiritually natural that those of the old law were supposed to work their way into being spiritually minded in the new law. That hardly ever happened. But in this case, this is an excellent example of him getting it, becoming aware, and then I'm assuming, based upon some of the conversation a little bit after this event with the leadership, I'm assuming he became a disciple of Christ along with others who saw this miracle.
Yeah, this guy is on the list of people I want to meet in heaven and find out if they're actually there, like Nicodemus. Every indication is that Nicodemus moved in this direction as well to a deeper faith, but there's a lot of people that I want to know the end of their story. And I'd love to know what happened, but the Bible's about Jesus and God's story, not necessarily all the secondary characters, if you will, but I'd love to know what happened to him. But we see the completion of this progress here. So Jesus comes back to him after allowing him to experience this pressure, allowing him to be questioned and grilled and ridiculed and threatened with excommunication, and they cast him out. So maybe that's an indication that he was cast out of the synagogue. Maybe he was willing to pay that price because he believed the truth. So Jesus comes to him in verse 35 and finds him. And again, you got to love Jesus' style. I'm going to sit back while this happens, but afterwards, I'm going to make it a point to go and find him and reaffirm that faith. Do you believe in the Son of God? And he answered, who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him? And Jesus says, you have both seen him, and it is he who is talking with you. And his answer in verse 38, his response, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. So again, if Jesus is not claiming to be God, he would say, whoa. We don't do that here. Don't bow down to me. Stand up. Don't worship me. You worship God only. But he worships him because he is God. We'll get to the response in just a moment, but I just wanted to point out this progress here. A man healed me. No, he's a prophet. No, you guys can't put this together. How silly of you. Clearly he's the Christ. And he bows down and worships him. So I think this is meant to tell us, the reader of John's gospel, what's supposed to happen in our lives as well. We're supposed to see ourselves progress like this blind man. Through some hardship, through some trials, through some questions, through some wrestling with finding answers, we're meant to deepen our faith and go from seeing Jesus as a teacher, a good man, to he's Lord, and worshiping him and being devoted to him. Mark?
Just the way it ends of don't resent your blessings and don't resent your existence. A number of people could
Gets you at the worst moment. Okay. So verse 40, we see his answer. Blindness. He responds in verse 39, for judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may be made blind. It's an interesting response. But see how some of the Pharisees who were with him heard these words and said to him, are we blind also? Now on the surface, it depends on what inflection you put in there. Are we blind also? Like it's a self-aware question, but I think it was probably more a sarcastic tone. Are you saying we're blind? We're the Pharisees. We're the ones in the know. As was pointed out, we're the experts. You calling us blind? I got to turn the page because the last verse is on the next page in my Bible. But Jesus said to them, if you were blind, you would have no sin. But now you say, we see, therefore your sin remains. What? That's a bit of a tongue twister there, isn't it? What's the point Jesus is making to the Pharisees here? They don't perceive themselves, you saying we're blind too? They don't perceive that they're blind, right? So what is the point with Jesus? First of all, verse 39. For judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see, and that those who see may be made blind. Who are the ones that see that he needs to make blind? Who would that be? And this has to use a little bit of backwards logic, I think, for this to make sense.
So in context, it would be the Pharisees?
Yeah. Do they really see, though? Are their eyes really opened? They just think they're the enlightened. I think this makes a lot of sense if you put it in the same context as the physician comes to those who are sick, not to those who are well. Does that mean the Pharisees are well and they didn't need healing from Jesus? Certainly not. It just means they didn't perceive how sick they were. And that kind of a peculiar thing that if you're blind, you would know it. But if we're talking about blindness of the soul or blindness of the mind, that's the worst part about it. You often don't even perceive that you're blind. Look at that example in Revelation chapter 3. I believe this is the Laodiceans. They were blind, but the worst part about it is they didn't even know they were blind. This is exactly what Jesus is describing. Chapter 3 of Revelation, verse 17. Because you say, I am rich and have become wealthy and have need of nothing, and do not know that you are wretched, miserable, poor, blind, and naked, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, that you may be rich, and white garments that you may be clothed, that the shame of your nakedness may not be revealed, and anoint your eyes with eye salve so that you may see. Okay. They didn't literally need a new wardrobe. This is all metaphorical. But that's the worst part is they didn't perceive their blindness. So I think, let's keep this as our lens, this idea, the Laodiceans, they thought they were rich. They thought they were wealthy. They thought they were, in splendored clothing. Does that not describe the Pharisees? How they viewed themselves? So keep that in mind. Let's go back to Jesus' words. So for judgment I have come into this world, that those who do not see may see. And that's this blind man. That's the average person. But they can tell they're blind. This blind guy didn't need to be reminded he was blind. He knew it. He needed to have his eyes opened. And that's anyone that is willing to be humble enough to say, I don't know, and I will learn from God. But if you think you see, and if you think you know it all, your eyes won't be opened, and you'll be completely blind to the fact that you are blind. I have to word it in a way that makes sense in my brain. Cecil? Okay. Who goes first? Okay, Cecil, then Jay.
Job 42 talks about seeing. He says, I heard of you by hearing of the ear. Now my eyes see. And certainly talking spirit. And so this is not something that just happened today. It happened in that dispensation. This has happened all along. And that it's God's will that we see him as who he is. And so he puts his son on this planet to have us be able to see who he is. And so this is that opportunity.
Yeah, and this is not a new metaphor to Jesus. So it's something a Jewish audience should understand. I'll get to Jay in just a second, but Isaiah 42 and verse 5, Thus says God, the Lord, who created heavens and stretched them out, who spread forth the earth, that which comes from it, who gives breath to the people on it and spirit to those who walk on it. I, the Lord, have called you in righteousness and will hold your hand. I will keep you and give you as a covenant to the people, as a light to the Gentiles, to open blind eyes, to bring out prisoners from the prison, those who sit in darkness from the prison house. To be set free from prison, you have to perceive that you are imprisoned. But this is a common metaphor that a Jewish audience should know. Jay?
It's a recurring theme throughout the Bible, but 1 Corinthians 1:27 lays it all out. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise,
Yeah. And that comes back to the last verse of this chapter, what Jesus says to them. If you were blind, you would have no sin, because I would open your eyes. If you knew of your sin, if you knew you're sick, I as the physician would heal you. If you perceived that you were in prison, I would set you free. But because you say, we see, your sin remains. And you stay in your blindness because you think you can see the truth. Now, we're out of time, but I just want to point out, as we get into the next section, the Good Shepherd, the next I am statement of Jesus, just because there's a chapter break doesn't mean we should think there's a break in the thought. Because when Jesus criticizes the shepherds, the hirelings, they abandon the flock. And Jesus says, not me. This is a continuation of his criticism of their blindness. So I just want you to see all the way down through verse 21. And even their response. These are not the words of one who has a demon. Well, actually, verse 20. He has a demon and is mad. They've been saying that all through the last 3 chapters. It's the same audience. It's the same context. Until we get to verse 22, and now the setting is the Feast of Dedication. So that's when the next change takes place. So read the next 20 verses or so in the same context as we've just been discussing. Any last questions or comments on this section?
We think 8, 9, and 10 after verse 21 all one day of the Sabbath.
I don't think they happen in one day, but I think that John thematically put them next to each other for a reason. So
The reason I ask that is you look at the end of chapter 8 where they were going to stone him, and then it says immediately he passed by this man.
yeah.
So it seems like this is a movement through, a march one day.
Yeah.
It could be
I think much of this does. I don't know that we're still in the Feast of Booths, or because he spoke in the middle of the Feast of Booths, but I don't know if we've passed that. But I know for sure it's John put it here thematically, and so thematically we're still in that setting of the Feast of Booths. So we'll discuss this a little more next week too. But just read chapter 10 in the same context as what we've just been discussing.